There was a sentence spoken over you at your baptism, or spoken over your parents, if you were too young to remember. And somewhere between the 1st century and the councils that followed, that sentence changed. Not the water, not the gesture, the words. A declaration that ancient Christians believed sealed a soul against something unseen was quietly rewritten, and most churches today don't even know it existed. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why some of the earliest Christian communities didn't see baptism as a symbolic washing at all. They saw it as a boundary line, a seal that certain forces could not cross. And once you understand what that seal was supposed to say, you'll never hear the words, "I baptize you," the same way again. For most of your life, you were probably taught that baptism has always looked roughly the same. Water, a name, a formula, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And that's essentially unchanged since the apostles themselves. It feels solid, ancient, untouchable. But historians of early Christianity have spent the last century piecing together something the standard story leaves out. The baptismal rite was not fixed early on. It was fluid, regional, and theologically loaded in ways that got smoothed over as the church centralized. Scholars like Kurt Rudolph, who spent decades cataloging Gnostic ritual texts, documented that multiple Christian communities in the 2nd and 3rd centuries used baptismal formulas that included explicit declarations, statements the initiate spoke or heard spoken over them that don't appear in the version that became standard. These weren't fringe curiosities. Some of these communities predate the theological structures we now call orthodox. The people spreading the simplified version weren't eyewitnesses passing down an unbroken tradition. They were bishops in the 3rd and 4th centuries, consolidating authority during a period when Christianity was fracturing into competing schools, and consolidation always means someone's version gets kept and someone else's gets erased. Here's a number that should give you pause. Textual historians have identified variant baptismal liturgies in at least half a dozen distinct early Christian and Sethian Gnostic sources, each with its own wording, its own theological emphasis, and in several cases, its own explicit declaration about what the ritual was actually doing to the soul. If baptism had always been one simple, agreed-upon act, why would that many independent communities be recording something more elaborate? The moment you sit with that question, something shifts. Maybe baptism wasn't just a welcome ritual. Maybe it was understood by real people who lived through the earliest generations of the faith as spiritual defense. So what was actually being said? What got taken out? That's where this gets interesting. Historians and researchers of Gnostic ritual texts have a name for the concept at the center of this: the seal. Not a wax seal, not a stamp. A spiritual seal, a mark placed on the soul at the moment of initiation that certain traditions believed made a person unreachable to specific hostile forces. The idea is simple enough to hold in your head. If the soul is vulnerable on its way back to its source, and if there are forces along that path trying to intercept it, then a ritual declaration at baptism functions like a passport stamped at a border crossing, visible to the right authorities, unreadable to the wrong ones. This is why some of the earliest Sethian Christian texts describe baptism not as one washing, but as a sequence, most famously the 5 seals, described in the text known as the Trimorphic Protennoia, discovered among the Nag Hammadi codices in 1945. It's not a fringe idea invented by outsiders to Christianity. It's Christian material, written by Christians, buried by Christians, in Christian language, describing a Christian ritual, just not the version that eventually won. Ancient people, across nearly every tradition, believed that names and declarations carried power, that speaking a truth aloud, in the right context, changed your standing in the unseen world. You don't have to fully accept that worldview to recognize that it was coherent, widespread, and taken seriously by the very people building the early church. The old wisdom traditions believed in the power of the spoken word. Modern cognitive research on ritual and belief, including work referenced by neuroscientist Andrew Newberg, on how structured spiritual practice measurably alters brain activity during moments of perceived transcendence, shows that ritualized declarations aren't just theater, they produce real, trackable shifts in a practitioner's state of mind. And practitioners of contemplative Christian mysticism, going back centuries, described baptism's original purpose in almost identical terms, not cleansing from sin in the modern sense, but sealing the soul against forces that would otherwise interfere with its return. Put those three things together, ancient text, embodied ritual science, and mystical testimony, and you start to see why this idea has staying power. I'm going to show you exactly what that declaration is believed to have said, and why removing it may have mattered more than anyone intended. Let's start with the historical layer, because this is where skeptics usually expect the argument to fall apart, and it doesn't. The Trimorphic Protennoia, part of Codex XIII from Nag Hammadi, describes a divine voice, Protennoia, first thought, descending through successive realms to rescue and awaken souls, and the ritual sequence associated with her descent is explicitly called the Five Seals. Scholars including John D. Turner, who has published extensively on Sethian Gnostic literature, have argued these 5 seals represent a baptismal initiation rite distinct from, and possibly older in some elements than, the simplified formula that later became standard. That's not fringe speculation. That's peer-reviewed textual scholarship sitting in university library shelves right now. But it's not the only proof. Let's move to the scientific layer. Research out of the HeartMath Institute, which studies the relationship between heart rhythm coherence and states of focused intention, has found that spoken declarations performed with full attention and emotional conviction correlate with measurable shifts in heart rate variability. Physiological markers associated with a state some researchers describe as coherence, and which contemplatives across traditions have long associated with spiritual protection or grounding. In other words, the ancient instinct to speak a sealing declaration out loud, with your full attention, wasn't superstition detached from the body. It maps onto something researchers can now put electrodes on and measure. But you don't have to take modern data alone. There's a case study layer too, and it comes from a place you wouldn't expect. Coptic Christian communities in Egypt, some tracing unbroken liturgical practice back well over 1,000 years, preserved baptismal rites with additional declarative elements that Western Christianity trimmed away during centuries of Latin standardization. Liturgical historians studying Coptic and Ethiopian Orthodox baptismal texts have documented spoken renunciations and affirmations, the initiate explicitly declaring rejection of hostile spiritual authorities as a formal, expected part of the rite, elements that softened or vanished almost entirely from the Roman rite by the medieval period. That's not theory. That's a living tradition, still practiced today, carrying a fossil of exactly the kind of declaration we're talking about. And here's where it gets almost impossible to dismiss as coincidence: the unexpected authority. Declassified United States government research, released through the CIA's own Gateway Process report from the 1980s, examined altered states of consciousness and repeatedly noted that subjects undergoing structured, intention-based verbal exercises reported experiences of boundary and protection strikingly similar to language used in ancient initiation texts. Language the researchers themselves, working in a secular military context with no religious agenda, hadn't set out to find. When a government laboratory studying consciousness stumbles onto the same structural idea that Gnostic Christians described nearly 2,000 years earlier, that's not proof of the supernatural, but it is proof that this isn't a fantasy invented by fringe mystics. It's a pattern showing up again, independently, across history, texts, physiology, and unexpected institutions. Ancient scripture, modern physiology, living liturgy, Cold War-era government research. 4 completely unrelated sources, converging on the same idea, that a spoken declaration at the threshold of initiation was believed to do something real, and that Christianity, in its earliest and most diverse form, took that idea seriously enough to write it down, ritualize it, and pass it on. So if this material existed, if communities across Egypt, across Sethian Christian circles, across the broader Gnostic world preserved a baptismal declaration with this kind of weight? Why don't you know about it? Why did it disappear from the mainstream rite almost entirely? Follow the pattern that always explains these things. Who benefited from the simpler version winning? By the 4th century, the Church was no longer a scattered network of house communities improvising their own liturgies. It was becoming an institution, and institutions need uniformity to function. One formula, one hierarchy, one chain of authority deciding what counts as valid baptism. A ritual that positioned the individual soul as capable of directly declaring its own protection, without a bishop's ongoing mediation, was a theological problem for a church consolidating power. Elaine Pagels, whose research on the Nag Hammadi library remains foundational, has written extensively about how doctrinal battles in this period were rarely just about abstract theology. They were about who got to control access to spiritual authority. A believer who understood baptism as something they actively declared, rather than something passively received through an approved clergy structure, was harder to govern. Simplify the formula, remove the declarative elements, and you shift power decisively from the individual back to the institution administering the rite. It's worth naming plainly what was lost in that shift. Not a doctrine, but a felt sense of participation. The individual's role as an active party in their own spiritual protection, replaced by a role as a passive recipient of someone else's authority. That's the personal cost sitting underneath the historical one. And to be clear, this isn't a story about evil men in robes plotting in candlelit rooms. It's something more mundane and more familiar. Large institutions, across every century and every culture, tend to simplify and centralize whatever gives ordinary people direct spiritual agency, because agency is difficult to administer. That's not a uniquely Christian failure, it's a human one. But naming the mechanism doesn't erase the loss. And once you see that a piece of the earliest tradition may have been trimmed away, not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient to manage, something in you is allowed to feel a quiet frustration. That frustration doesn't need to turn into cynicism about faith itself. It can turn into something more useful, a decision to reclaim what was set aside. Because here's the good news, and this is the part I actually want you to walk away with today. You don't need institutional permission to reconnect with this practice. The essence of the sealing declaration survives clearly enough in the source texts that you can adapt it into something meaningful in your own contemplative life, right now, without needing anyone's authorization. Here is how, in 3 steps. Step 1. The simplest entry point. Each morning, before your day begins, speak a short declaration aloud. Not silently, aloud, because the ancient and the modern research agree that vocalization matters. Something as direct as, I am sealed. I am known. I am not reachable by what does not serve my return. Say it slowly. Feel the words land in your chest, not just your mind. This alone, done consistently, begins to train the kind of focused coherence the HeartMath research associates with genuine physiological shift. Step 2. Once the first habit is steady, pair the declaration with a physical gesture. Many contemplatives use the same tracing of the seal motion associated with the sign of the cross, but you can use something as simple as placing your hand over your heart as you speak. The body remembers ritual faster than the mind does, and pairing word with gesture is what the ancient rite was doing structurally, whether or not the 4th century church wanted you to know that. Step 3, and this is the deepest layer, reserved for once the first 2 feel natural. Extend the declaration into moments of stress or fear during your day. Not just the morning ritual, but in the instant something threatens to pull you into anxiety, spiritual doubt, or despair. Pause and silently repeat the sealed declaration as a return to center. This is where the ancient framing of boundary becomes genuinely practical, not abstract. Now, an important alert. This practice is not a substitute for your existing faith community, your pastor, your therapist, or any medical or mental health care you may need. Treat it as a contemplative supplement, not a replacement for real relationships and real support. And be patient with the timeline. Most people who adopt a practice like this notice a subtle shift in their sense of groundedness within 2 to 3 weeks of daily repetition. Not dramatic, not instant, but real, and it deepens the longer you stay consistent. So let's bring this back to where we started. A sentence spoken over you or someone you love, at the very beginning of a spiritual life. A sentence that once may have carried far more weight than "I baptize you in the name of." A declaration of boundary, a seal. Trimmed away not because it was disproven, but because it was inconvenient for a growing institution to manage. You've walked through the historical text, the physiological science, the living Coptic liturgy, and even a strange echo from a declassified government report. 4 unrelated threads pointing at the same forgotten truth. You are no longer someone who assumes the version of Christianity you were handed is the only version that ever existed. That matters. That's not a small shift. That's the beginning of spiritual literacy most people never reach. And this is exactly the kind of forgotten thread we chase down here on Awakened Minds. Because these buried pieces of the earliest Christian world don't stay buried once enough of us start asking the right questions. There's another piece of this we haven't touched yet. What happens after the seal? When the soul actually begins its ascent, and the specific names early Christians believed you needed to know at each stage of that journey. That's a video on its own, and it's coming. For now, if this declaration resonated with you, or if you felt something shift while reading it aloud just now, drop the word "seal" in the comments below. I read every one, and it helps me know which of these forgotten threads to chase next. If you haven't yet, subscribe to Awakened Minds, because we go looking for exactly this kind of buried history every week, and you don't want to miss where this leads. Until next time, stay sealed, stay awake, and keep asking what else they left